How do you deal with the C player in the leadership team? Well, I guess we've already answered that question.
Yeah. I mean, the one thing that I think a lot of people still struggle with, though, is what if the C player is the CEO? That's a harder one.
Welcome to TipTop, Grow Up Your Business with Metronomics. Join me, Shannon Burns-Huskow, and Metronomics certified coach, Ged Roberts.
We'll be talking to business thought leaders, entrepreneurs, CEOs, and business team coaches who have all taken the journey to grow up their businesses to their tip top.
We'll be sharing strategies, systems, stories on how you can grow your company up at the speed you want.
If you're searching for your path to the tip top and feel your time is running out, then this podcast is for you. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. My name's Ged Roberts. I'm a certified Metronomics coach and one of the hosts of the Metronomics Podcast. Today I'm with Ken Lewis. How are you, Ken?
I'm doing really well, Jed. How are you?
I'm very good. I'm looking forward to our conversation. We're going to cover off accountability and culture in leadership teams. So that's a big topic. So I'm sure we're going to have much to talk about today, particularly from our respective experiences as Metronomics coaches.
Yes, it'll be a lot of fun. I'm looking forward to it.
So Ken, you're based in Victoria, British Columbia. Is that right?
I am, yes.
Okay, awesome. I've yet to get there, so I'm looking forward to that next trip.
Yeah, you were so close in April. Yeah, not too far away.
I was close. Yeah. So Ken, leadership team accountability and culture. That's a big topic, and particularly that term culture. What does that mean to you?
Culture. Oh, well, I mean, there's so much related to culture. Culture, from my perspective, means that it's so many different aspects of what's important to run the business. But it's really why are you there? It's your purpose. It's your BHAG is involved in your culture, and it's the core values that you live by. And when we talk about core values, anybody who's been involved in the metronomic system realizes that it's not just a list of things you put on the wall. It's really the values that you live by, that you hire and fire by.
So what happens when you walk into a company and you see those lists of platitudes on the wall? And you can almost feel the atmosphere, and they're not right, and even if they were right, they're not being lived by the people in the organization. It's almost palpable, isn't it? You can feel that mismatch as you walk into a business. Yeah. What happens to you there? Do you think, oh my God, I've got some work to do here, or oh, I love this challenge, or
Oh no, it's what an opportunity this is. What a great opportunity this is. That's the part that's really exciting. And if they are on the wall and you're successful and you're making progress, they come off the wall.
yeah. What happens when you go into a company and the leadership team don't really get the whole point of the cultural system? They don't really, as far as they're concerned, it's a checkbox thing. They've done core values. They've come up with some sort of mission, but as far as they're concerned, it's just something that someone told them to do at business school, and they've moved on. How do you go about changing the mindset of that sort of that approach?
Well, I usually have a conversation with the whole leadership team and say, no matter what business you're in, there's a culture. Whether you know it or not, there's a business culture. And sometimes I use an example. It's almost a fictitious example. I said, but if you're a broker on Wall Street, there's a culture. It might not be the culture that you would want if you were running a business, but there's a culture there. It might be a cutthroat. The person who gets to the top survives, everybody else doesn't make it, but it's a culture. So I often use that as an example. I said, so there's a culture. And the question is, what culture do you want to work in? And then I often go around the room and ask people, if they've had some business experience, if they worked in multiple organizations, I try to get people to tell me stories as to why they might have left an organization.
Yeah, I mean, I've personally got a real example of that, and this is probably about 15, maybe 20 years ago. A lot earlier in my career, I joined an organization that was just growing so fast, and this was before my time as a coach, and everyone loved the culture. Everyone was buzzed, everyone was pumping, people came in early, they worked really hard, they stayed late, they did it with a smile on their face. but inside the organization, it just didn't feel right. It just didn't feel right. I could not, and it wasn't the hours. I've worked long hours. I'm used to sort of working hard. The culture just repelled me, and their culture repelled me. It was like, I'm not right here. I'm not right here. And I knew within 2 weeks that I wasn't right, and I was gone in 6 weeks. And I actually see that as a really, really good part of my career, good stage in my career, because I experienced that firsthand. And after that, I took culture seriously because I'd experienced it firsthand.
I've had similar experiences. I can think of at least two. One very similar to you. Early in my career, I moved from a job that I really, really liked. This was an opportunity for a promotion, and I lasted there for maybe 6 weeks. I was gone after 6 weeks. The culture just was not a fit. And then there was another one just before I actually moved out west from, I was living in Ontario, just outside of Toronto before that. And the last position I had before I moved out west, I was only there for 6 or 7 months, and I had to go. And I remember taking over a job as the um, managing director or general manager of a division of a big multicultural business in Toronto. And, I inherited a team of about 140 people. And the culture that had been established there was one that I wasn't 100% comfortable with. Prior to that, I had been working with the company for a while, but maybe I was a little bit removed from it because I was out on the road and traveling a lot. So I wasn't in the head office all the time. But there was a culture kind of like similar to what you described, where so now I was the senior person on site, and people would make a point to get into the office before I got there and stay until I left, assuming that that was a requirement.
Yeah.
I was
Mhm.
like, that's not the culture. That's not the behavior I'm setting out here. How come people are doing that? There was some work to be done.
Yeah, 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 and that works in some organizations,
It
but
does.
it's a match between individuals and groups, and the group selects and the individual selects, and normally it works out. And yeah, I think you've got to be your EQ has to be severely lacking if you don't feel when you're not a fit for the culture.
But isn't it interesting though that it kind of settles itself, but it takes so much time? So that's the beauty of what we do. I mean, we got a system that helps identify it. It helps identify people who aren't culture fit. It's all part of being an A player. I mean, that's a huge part of being a player. It's not just how good you are at doing what you're required to do or what your functions are. It's all about being a fit for the team.
Well, one of the challenges we often see, and interested to hear your thoughts here, is the and I sort of alluded to this as a question earlier on. The walking into a new business, new company, and they just don't see the importance. And okay, let's say for example, say you convince them that okay, you need a purpose, you need core values, you need a long term goal, a big hairy audacious goal, and they tell the team what it is once and maybe twice, and then they complain that the team don't get it. And I guess I'm calling out to Patrick Lencioni's concept of over communication. How many times do you need to tell a team, tell an individual, tell a group what the culture is before they start getting it?
And there's not a number, but it's a high number. But I can tell you when you know. When you know is when they start laughing at you for doing it. They almost mimic you. They're making fun, all in good jest. But it's like they say they start mimicking you and saying, "We know, Ken, we know, Ken," or "We know, what it is." So
That is so true. I hadn't actually made that connection. I was with a team just a couple of weeks back, and yeah, that happened. That happened. They said, like, no, we get it, we get it. You don't need to tell us again and again. We live this all the time. We've been living this for years. That was the culture. All you guys did is put it in a way that we could articulate, but we've always done that. And that was like, no, yeah, they've got it. They've got it. We've got it. We've got it.
but you still can't stop because if they're a growing team, so that's the other thing that I remember as a CEO. I would say this in the room, and we would have our monthly all hands meeting and go through all this. And I would always start with everything, right from the core purpose, the core values, the BHAG, everything. And people would make fun of me. And then I would say, there are 4 people here who just joined our organization. and they haven't heard it as much as you. So they'll learn it pretty quickly, and they'll get it. But let's make sure everybody else hears it as much as you did.
That trifecta, the purpose, the values, and the big, hairy, audacious goal. Which one of those do you think takes the longest to settle down with clarity and relevance?
The one that I think takes the longest to articulate properly is the values. And the reason I say that is that they're there, um, but they need to be described a little bit better. You can work through this. There's I don't want to say there's fewer tools, but if you're going to go through your core purpose and your the hedgehog is a great way to work through all that sort of stuff. So you can kind of hone in on it more quickly. And the purpose is usually driven by the reason the company got started in the first place. But the values, they can evolve a little bit with time, depending on whether there's transitions. And I just found it's a little bit harder to articulate because you don't get them at.
Yeah, okay. And Ken, you mentioned the hedgehog there. I mean that's a Jim Collins concept, I think, in Good to Great. That's the book that hedgehog is in. Yeah. So it's interesting. You find that the that the values are the longest to settle. In my experience, and this is maybe our different experiences as coaches and leaders, it's always the purpose that takes the longest to settle down. Values, they come out pretty quickly. I mean, you might have to refine them a little bit, but they're pretty close. So I find that the purpose is a thing that companies that I coach come back to again and again, and they rethink, and it might sort of be right, but they're not quite happy with how it's articulated, and so for me, it can be 1 or 2 years before they really get to a point where their purpose is super super clear and resonates. But with others, their purpose is clear before I even walk in through the door. And when that happens, your job's going to be a lot easier.
Right. Definitely. Definitely. And like you said, the values, I think maybe I'm thinking back after you made that comment, it's probably not that they need to be established because they're there. It's it that the challenge is describing them properly. Articulate them in a very brief form so that people understand what they mean. And that comes when they're recognized. When I say recognized, when you're recognizing behavior, in the organization, when it's a good news thing, so and so did this, and that's a real great, representation of how we live this value in this company.
Now, if you're enjoying this podcast on leadership, team accountability, and culture, don't forget to like and subscribe and hit that notification bell so you get notified of future drops. So, Ken, let's move onto accountability, accountability in leadership teams, and I'm sure we'll come back to culture in a moment anyway. But let's move on to accountability. What process do you go through? And I presume it's sort of like the process that we talk about in Metronomics. Do you have a specific process that you go to firstly make leadership teams aware of what accountability truly is, and then reinforcing that accountability? Do you have a specific approach?
I mean, other than I think the system that we follow is the approach that makes the difference. One of the biggest challenges I find teams have is that they all feel that they're doing what they need to do, but they're not measuring what they're doing, or they don't know how to measure that. So, I mean, for me, like accountability is the ownership of a commitment, but also the transparency and the follow through associated with that commitment. And, from other podcasts you've said, and it's been articulated very well, accountability is not responsibility. Someone else could be doing the work, but you are the one that owns it.
And that is often a misunderstanding that we as coaches have to clarify very, very quickly. But it always amazes me that people who have been in business 20, 30 years and they still don't necessarily understand the difference in those concepts. And how did they get to where they are, not knowing the differences in those concepts, which just makes it a very, very fertile ground for us. There's lots of companies that need our help.
And I think the really big aha moment usually comes in the kickoff when you go through, the functions that people own. And you just list all the functions, and I'll usually prepare something for them that lists a function that exists in every organization, regardless of what they do, and then let them add functions to it. But we go through that blind assessment and I ask everybody to say, okay, who owns that? I put them, if you use Mural, which is a great tool that I like to use. I became certified as a coach during the pandemic. So Mural was a great way to get this. Actually, I came certified before it, I think, but I mean, had to use the tool, right? And so you put everybody in the privacy mode and get everybody to write a name down. And it's amazing how a team that's been working together for a long period of time will all say somebody else owns it, or two people own it, or three people own it, or nobody owns it. So that's almost the first step. How can you be accountable for a function or a responsibility, or a function in I shouldn't say responsibility, a function in the organization, and not know who owns it?
Yeah, as they say, if more than one person's accountable, no one's accountable.
That's right. They're not. And that's the first step. So you go through that, and then I'll try to push it as much as I can. If it's obvious to me that somebody really does own it, that they're just afraid to own it, I might challenge it so they will that, but I might give them, some homework to go away for the next time we get back and say, okay, well, figure out, because just as you say, I'll tell them. So more than one person owns it, nobody owns it. So who's really going to own it? Doesn't mean you don't work on it, but who's going to own it? And then, of course, that leads into the KFFM, which is, such a great tool. And that's a tool that really helps to reinforce accountability even more, because it basically shows you, how your organization makes money.
I've just finished a kickoff with a new client, and I'm sort of thinking back to the conversation we had. Probably around 10 o'clock on day one, where we asked the question, who is the head of the company, and normally that conversation goes pretty quick.
It does.
but it didn't 2 days ago, and the conversation seemed to go around. Well, it's a partnership, and we know partnerships can be problematic, particularly around accountability and ownership. And the people confuse equity with control and the like. Uh, but the conversation was going around. Well, who is actually in charge? Who is the person that has the ultimate say? And it was actually a partnership that was a part of a much bigger partnership. So multiple offices, each branch had their own leadership team, and some big businesses, $20 million businesses. And so the conversation went, well, ultimately we report to a larger group, a chairman and a larger board. So are they in charge? Well, they don't make day-to-day decisions. They're going to make policy decisions. They're going to make sort of key decisions that affect the company as a whole, but they're not going to make your operational day-to-day decisions. So let's not say that they're in charge. So then the conversation moved over to, okay, well, is it the largest equity owner that is in charge? And I said, well, okay, who's the largest equity owner? And someone put their hand up. They had 1% more than someone else. It was marginal. And I said, do you want to be in charge? And he said, oh, I don't want to be in charge. No. Okay. So, we eventually iterated back towards the person that clearly should have been the person that was up there in the first place. But they had to go through the conversation. They had to have the discussion just to make sure that everyone was okay, that the person they thought should have been up there, the initials they thought should have been up there, ended up being up there. So that exercise, just that first sticky note that we put up there for head of company, that's normally done in 30 seconds. It was a good 20-minute conversation before we got the right person up there. And it's an interesting thing. And this comes back to Patrick Lencioni's 5 dysfunctions of a team, which we probably call out in every single one of these podcast episodes. That was that level 2, having that conversation, having that discussion, everyone having had the chance to have their word heard.
Absolutely. And the answer might be known by the head of the company, but might not be known by the leadership team.
Yeah, look, I think they all did really, but they just wanted to make sure that everyone was happy, and it was done very amicably. It was done as a very very nice discussion with with a few sort of challenges, but it was we got to a point where at the end of the day everyone was clear. They knew who was going to call the shots if shots needed to be called.
Oh, I had a slightly different experience with one of my earliest clients that I started working with during the kickoff, where there was two partners. Actually, there was three partners that owned the business. One was an investor and not involved in day to day, and the other two were actually involved in the business. One had the title of CEO, and the other had a senior position within the organization. And so it was clear who was head of company, and there was nobody disputing that. But as we got into discussions about core values and the importance of culture and fit, it became evident that one of the partners wasn't a fit. And in day two, he wasn't there. He had been let go
At the end of day one, they actually
at
let
the
him
end of
go.
day one. I mean, he clearly still owned the business.
Yeah.
He had a position on the board, but he was no longer had an active position within the company.
Yeah, well, equity is not the same as a job. No, you
It
might have both, but you don't have to have both.
That's right.
Mm-hmm. How did the team react to that? Was there shock? Was there surprise? Was it like, so glad that happened, that needed to happen? Because often teams react in surprising ways. Some people who have maybe been institutionalized think, well, how can you possibly do that to someone? How could you humiliate them like that? But you're actually not. You're setting them free.
I mean, I don't think it ended all that well for the company because it got a little bit different at the ownership level later on. But from the team's perspective, I think they were surprised that it happened when it did, but I don't think anybody thought it was the wrong choice. So it really made the second day actually a lot more productive because there were a lot of interruptions in the first day.
I'm looking down at my list of questions, and my one of the questions is, how do you deal with the C player in the leadership team? Well, I guess we've already answered that question, haven't we?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the one thing that I think a lot of people still struggle with, though, is what if the C player is the CEO?
Yeah.
That's a harder one because there's nobody else in the room that's going to make that call.
Have you had to deal with that? I mean, I have, but not recently. I have.
I have had to deal with it, and it's definitely not easy. But one or two things is going to happen. They're going to acknowledge it, or you're going to stop working together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I guess it can be addressed. It can be resolved. But it takes a very, very self-aware CEO with a lot of humility to really be able to make that call.
Oh, definitely. So, if we're looking about, books that we've read that we reference often, the leadership circle, they have to be very far away from the reactive side of the spectrum and be on the creative mindset side of this to be able to acknowledge that.
Yep. And it's also part of the 5 dysfunction story, isn't it?
It is.
The CEO steps aside and yeah.
He does. Yeah. I mean, it's I love those fables. I mean, they all work out quite well.
Well, a story can be written in any way to achieve any
It's
outcome,
true.
any ending you want, can't it?
That's right. That's right. A bad ending could also be a lesson, right? So
Yep. One of the situations I've encountered is and I'm thinking back to a company I worked with a couple of years ago, or ended working with a couple of years ago. Now, the CEO he said he believed in core values, but when it came to hiring, particularly around leadership team members, he hired people in his own image. And what he ended up with was a leadership team that were very, very much like him, that were yes people, that wouldn't challenge him. He was a very, very strong character, that was for sure. But he ended up with a revolving door of leadership team members. And he never gave the culture a chance to bed down in his leadership team because he was moving leaders on literally every 3, 4, 5 months. So we never got to a point where the leadership team had actually settled down and was given a chance to actually live the values, live the culture. And I use DISC as one of my assessment tools with the leadership teams that I work with. And I said to the CEO, we've been working together for 18 months now, and at no point in that 18 months have I felt that the leadership team was stable enough to start doing DISC assessments, because the leadership team needs to be stable. It's changed so much that any assessment would have been out of date within a few months. And his take was, well, I hire high performers, and I know that I can get about 18 months to 2 years out of them. And at that point, they won't be suitable for where we're going to be because we're a fast-growing company. And they were a very, very fast-growing company, a frighteningly fast-growing company. But that strategy, well, it's a tactic really, it's not a strategy. That tactic just didn't work for the company. And I stopped working with them about 2 years ago, and it didn't end well. Didn't end well at all.
I imagine that would be that must have been exhausting for the CEO.
Look, I think he thrived on the chaos. I
Oh,
think he thrived on the chaos that was around him. Yeah.
oh, okay. Well, there's a culture for you. It's
Well,
been defined.
indeed. Yeah, yeah,
It's not
yeah.
one that I would want to work in, though.
No, indeed. Well, exactly. And I ejected from that, and I'm very,
Yeah,
very glad I did. Yeah. Mhm.
yeah, I bet. Yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
No, that's a good reason to eject.
Now, if you're enjoying this podcast, don't forget to like and subscribe and hit that notification bell so you get notified of future drops. So, Ken, we've talked about accountability within functions. So, how we distribute or how we assign accountability to different functions in the business. So let's move on now to accountabilities in other parts of the system, in other parts of the business. Yeah, we set accountability for functions, but we also set accountability for metrics, and we also set accountability for priorities. So how do we address those sorts of accountabilities within the business and the system that we coach?
Well, I mean, this is all part of the system that we use, and I have to say we benefit now today. When I first started using this system, it didn't exist, but we have a software that allows you to manage this a lot more easily than it was done in the past. So I mean, good for our clients now. It was tougher many years ago before it existed that everything was a manual process, but it doesn't really matter what tool you're using. The thing is, you have to set those accountabilities up. And one of the biggest challenges is you have to understand what you're accountable for. So if we talk a little bit about priorities, how do one of the biggest things that I think I repeat the most frequently in any session that I'm doing with a client is, write your account, your priority as a SMART goal. So what are you committing to, and when are you going to do it? By, those are the things you got to do. But to do that in one meeting and assume that it's just going to happen, it's not going to work. There, you know, as clear as you are, even if you got grade A players, they're going to do it, but people are going to forget that it's important. So you want to tie those accountabilities into the progress you're making with the organization. People need to understand how they're contributing to the growth of the organization, to your one hag, your three hag, your B hag, to driving towards your purpose. All of those things are important. So, one of the best things that we have is the meeting system, the cadence of meetings that we use to keep people accountable. And it's one of the things that you have to start so early with your clients. And if you don't get them going on that, you don't get them into that habit, they will struggle to succeed.
Yeah, you mentioned smart goals there, and a bit like accountability. It always amazes me. People are prepared to put vague statements up around a priority, and then look puzzled at you when you ask them, how are you going to tell at the end of the quarter, at the end of the year, whether or not this was successfully completed? How will the other people in the room who are there to hold you to account to ensure it does finish, how will they know whether it is completed? And the blank stare of, well, it's a marketing program. Yeah, okay. What about the marketing program? What are the things that are going to tell you that you have successfully completed? Have you generated X number of leads? Have you ran 10 campaigns? What are the things that are going to tell you that it's been successfully done? I mean, that's a very difficult mindset shift. And a lot of people really struggle with that because, well, in the first instance, if you write something vague, then no one can hold you to account on it. So that's often a position I see. So when you've eventually convinced them that that it needs to be something that you can actually check against at stages and at the end, they're probably more likely to come up with something that can be measured. But that still doesn't mean that they're going to hold themselves to account as the quarter or as the year goes on.
That's right. And I've seen, actually, typically coming from a C player who eventually doesn't stay on the team, people committing to accountabilities that they've been working on in advance that are 90% finished so that they can say over the next 90 months, this will be done. But, half the team knows that they've almost finished it already, and we will often do those those meetings, clearly potentially a month before the quarter is going to start. So, before the quarter even starts, it'll be finished. It's like, no, that's not what we're talking about here. How are we going to advance that?
That's interesting. I have to admit I've never seen that, but that would be super. That's also a big tale, isn't it?
It is. I mean, that's a C player tell right away.
That's not the right person.
That's not the right person. So and the way to get people to get comfortable, but you're right. People are not comfortable doing that. The vagueness means that they can check it off their list and say, well, I did do it. And it's like, well, yeah, but I'm not really happy with the result. Well, that's because it wasn't defined well enough. So what is it? A SMART goal is specific, it's measurable, it's achievable, but it's relevant. It has to be relevant to what you're doing, and it has to be done in a timely fashion. And so all those things have to be done. And I'll have team members in sessions who know how to write a SMART goal. They're now comfortable, but they'll just put a couple of buzzwords down and say, I'll get the SMART goal written later. It'll be, no, let's do it now. Let's do it right now. We have to do it now because I want someone to challenge him if it's not right.
Yeah, even if you have to put down some bullet points that have numbers or things that you can actually, objectively assess or complete, there needs to be something. You might want to wordsmith it later, but the detail stays in.
And, especially when you're pulling the corporate priorities for either a quarter or, when you're setting things up for a new annual meeting. But the corporate quarterly priorities are corporate, so somebody owns them. So that is going to be there if they own it. It's their number one individual priority. So those have to be wordsmith. They can be wordsmith afterwards, but I usually I force the person who's going to own it to be the one that writes it in the format that they're going to be comfortable with. I need you to write it because I want to make sure, well, everybody wants to make sure that you understand what it is you're committing to. Because often that suggestion for the number one thing that the company must do in the next 90 days is not written by the person who's eventually going to own it. And then they'll say, oh, that should be me. I should own that. So now it's like, okay, then if you own it, you write it. Write it the way you understand it.
And if what's on the wall isn't what you understand it as, rewrite it and then run it past the rest of the team, because that's often when things start falling off.
That's right. And it's a great exercise because very often it's understood and they are writing it in a way that helps them understand it better. It's much easier to commit to doing that if you get to say what it is you're going to do. But often it's a complete mismatch to what the rest of the team intended. And then that leads to usually a longer discussion.
So moving on to accountability for metrics. So, we during the kickoff, we identify, most of the metrics, and they may change as we refine and as we evolve over the quarters. But what I find is that over the first quarter, there's often reluctance to actually call out the numbers, call out the metrics. So we're trying to get our daily huddles in place, we're getting our weekly meetings in place, we're getting our monthly meetings in place. But there's a point at which most of the leadership team, the high performers, the ones who are culturally aligned, so the A players, they start seeing the value of calling out the numbers frequently. But there's often one, maybe two people who don't really want to call them out. And they're saying, well, I know what the number is. Why am I calling it out? I said, well, you might know what the number is. And okay, what is it? Oh, yeah, let me just check. No, so you don't know what the number is. But the point there is that, it's not about them knowing it, whether they do or whether they don't. It's about the rest of the team hearing it. Yeah. So one of the things I do, which really rattles leadership teams is, well, if I'm doing a run through, a role play, or, if I'm running their daily huddle or their weekly or their monthly, whatever, just in the early days, I'll ask the head of people to tell me what the sales number is. And the reaction is, well, I'm the head of people. I don't know what the sales number is.
Yes,
Said, well,
yes.
You heard it yesterday. They called it out yesterday, and didn't they? Oh, they did, but I don't remember. It's like, okay. Are we on track or are we off track? I don't know. So, so the teams I work with, they are ready for me to call out someone who isn't accountable to see if they know what the other person's number is.
Yes.
And they get used to that pretty quickly. And so they're paying attention.
Yeah, I'm just making a note. That's a tool I'm going to use more frequently. I think I've done it inadvertently once or twice, but no, that's a wonderful thing to do. I will include that in the next meeting I run. Yeah, but you're right. I mean, we want every member of the team to be an expert in the business, regardless of what their function is. And I usually get the biggest pushback from the exact example used from the person that's, who has a human resources type function or people related function, because they view that as an administrative, almost supporting function. But if if you're if you're counting on A players to be successful in the business, you better understand what it is they have to be successful at.
And often the question of, if someone is giving you vibes that they don't want to be there, something's more important, ask them, why are you here? And they'll say, well, I'm head of people, or I'm head of legal, or I'm head of IT. And it's like, well, actually, no, you're not. You're here because you're a member of the leadership team. Yeah. Yeah. When you leave this meeting, you revert back to your functional role. But in this meeting, you are a member of the leadership team.
But when that seems to change and people get it is after everybody's got a scorecard.
Okay. Well, that's a really good segue into scorecards.
Yes. And we always start with the first scorecard being the CEO scorecard. And that ties right into showing the accountability and saying, okay, here's what I'm committing to. Here's what I own. Here's how I'm going to be measured. And actually using that as a great example.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
And but then you want the rest of the leadership team to have scorecards, and you want it done sooner than later.
The quicker you can get scorecards in place, the faster you see leadership team cohesion, and the faster you see results.
That's right. And the faster you have C players that are on the leadership team leaving.
Yes. I worked through a scorecard with a CEO just a couple of weeks ago, and very, very experienced CEO, but has worked in a up until he took over about a year ago, he'd worked in a stagnant SaaS company that hadn't really grown about 5 years. And we put his scorecard together, and he was saying, well, okay, but my scorecard hasn't got revenue. And I said, well, is revenue your accountability? And he said, well, I'm the CEO. Surely it's my accountability. I said, well, actually, it's not. I mean, you're a CEO of a SaaS business. Your COO is accountable for ongoing revenue, and your head of sales is accountable for new revenue. And he said, I can give them that accountability. Yeah. Well, do you think you can? He said, well, they're able for it. So that means I don't really need to worry about it. I said, well, you do need to worry about holding them to account for the numbers.
That's right.
But you're not accountable for the numbers. And I think that made him realize that just like that, he could let go of a huge amount of accountability that he'd been taking on unnecessarily.
Yeah. Or if he didn't feel comfortable letting go of that accountability, he knew he had to make a change.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yeah. And the reality was he was okay with letting it go. And it was a revelation to him that he could.
Mm-hmm. It almost leads into, what we call the coach cascading system. Right. When you think about it, eventually you should be able to let more and more go as your leaders, and then the levels below them become coaches for their own teams, and they all have their scorecards. They all know what they're accountable. They've all made sure they have A player teams within their departments, and then they can let a lot of this go. And that's when growth really starts to happen.
Yeah, which is addressing the first barrier to growth, which is leadership. The inability of the existing leadership team to develop the next level of leaders so they can elevate what they do to more strategic market and customer facing activities and delegate the things that used to drag them down to the next level.
So have you experienced the opposite, where the CEO is almost at the point where they want to abdicate sooner than later because they just don't want to do it? So they think what they're doing is giving accountability to someone who should own something, but they're not ready for it. And they just think, no, then I don't have to worry about this because I told them that it was theirs.
Look, I haven't, but I've heard of that happening a lot. Yeah, I've heard of that happening a lot. And I think the closest I've come to that is a CEO that was tired. He was really, really exhausted. He was burnt out, and once we'd run the process, once we trusted the system for about 3 quarters, he suddenly got reinvigorated and wanted to re-engage with his own business because he was starting to have fun.
Okay.
So,
Well,
so
that's good.
whereas yeah, absolutely. So whereas before he was pretty much on his way out, thinking of a sale, he brought me in to get the business ready for sale, so that he could basically, get rid of something that was burning him out. And in the end, the business became fun again, and he ended up staying. He ended up staying quite some
And
time.
didn't sell.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and didn't sell. Yeah, didn't sell because A, he didn't need to, B, he didn't want to, and C, he was having fun.
Yes. Yeah. Well, that's great. That's a great end to a story like that. But you're right. I think that often is the case. A burnout is what's driving that behavior more than, a lack of interest. They just don't have that capacity anymore. But usually that's why they called us.
If I'm talking to a prospective CEO or prospective CEO clients, and when I sometimes hear, well, we just need to go and get funding and then we'll engage you, or we're going through a sales process because we can't keep on going as we are, and then we'll engage you. I know that's never ever going to happen, because they're going to get absorbed by another company, or they're going to take in money, and the controlling interest is going to shift, and they probably won't see the value of a coach. So when I hear that, it's like, okay, I'll send them occasional newsletters just to keep them in touch, but I'm spending no more time working with them because they're not in the right mindset to be coached.
That's right. And thinking about it, in we use an app called Circle amongst the coaches. There was very recently a story about a coach who was getting that sort of feedback from a prospect who was delaying, and I think that was some of the feedback that was received or provided by some of the coaches. It might have even been you that provided that to say, "Are you sure they're coachable? Are you sure they really need this? Or they definitely need it, but are you sure they want it? Are they ready for you?"
If someone doesn't think they need a coach, they don't need a coach. Yeah, it's just not going to work.
Yeah, and it's not fun for a coach.
No, no, no. And I guess this leads us on to sort of talking about the character of a CEO and the type of character that is best suited to benefit from coaching. And Jim Collins talks about level 5 leadership. The combination of indomitable will. I'm not sure if I've said that first word correctly, but I'm sure you know what I mean. That will that cannot be suppressed, that cannot be put down. The combination of that alongside humility. How do contrary to what a lot of people think, the best CEOs are often not these very, very extroverted, flamboyant, outgoing personalities, front men. They're often the quieter, more reserved CEOs that just sort of get on with it, don't necessarily want the attention, don't necessarily want the limelight, but that will, that indomitable will, and that combination of humility is what gets a lot of CEOs much, much further than that outward, brash, loud CEO persona.
I had the experience of working with somebody like that once, and I just, to this day, I still think of him. He was a senior. He was a member of the board of a big multinational that I worked with. That I worked for, sorry. And he came to the North, he was based out of Germany, and he came to the North American annual meeting and he spoke. But when this man got up on stage or even spoke to a small crowd, he was so unassuming and he was so quiet. But whenever he started to talk, you could hear a pin drop in the room because people respected everything about what he did. He had exactly what you just said. He knew exactly what was important, and I've never had anybody ask me questions the way he asked. Not a repertoire of questions, but just like key questions to make you think about what you should be doing next. And he'd just let you answer it yourself, and you'd walk away saying, "Wow, I would never have thought of that." Like he's brilliant, and there was no credit taken, there was nothing. He was just so unassuming, and that's the successful ones, right? That's what you see, not the one that's looking for the most likes on LinkedIn or whatever.
Yeah, and that's humility, leads to vulnerability. If you're prepared to be vulnerable, not just the CEO but the whole leadership team, and for a lot of leaders, this is it's a challenging thing because they've built their career by having this iron facade that they that means that they're untouchable, that they're was it not shatterproof isn't the right word, but you understand what I mean. They can't be broken. They're always going to have that that mask, which isn't necessarily the right approach to building good teams. It's great for building silos. It's not great for building good teams.
Well, and they have to demonstrate that. This is the humility and just being open to share your own failures. People, a good leader, an A-player leader, will embrace a failure as a learning experience and recognize that it's part of the process. I mean, Jim Collins says it best. Usually you're failing on the things that you're firing bullets at, not cannonballs, right? So that's part of the process. You're doing it with the opportunity to fail if it's meant to fail. But if you don't give those things a try, you know, it's, assuming you've done the homework to say this is worth going for, and to stand up in front of the whole group and say, I failed at this, and that's okay. This is what I learned. And it's okay for you to do that too, by the way.
Yeah, absolutely. You're giving people permission. Yeah.
They have to have that permission. Yeah.
So vulnerability is a big part of that, and I think vulnerability and coachability are probably two different sides of the same coin. Do you probe about coachability when you're talking to a prospective CEO client? Do you have a way of assessing whether or not they're coachable?
Well, I mean, I will ask for the biggest failures, definitely during that conversation and say, and part of that comes out right when you ask why they're calling you or why they want to work with you. Um, if it's well, I got a team that needs help, and I and there's nothing in that statement that suggests that they might be part of the team. They own a team and the team needs help and they don't know what to do next. Well, then maybe part of that is you. And if it doesn't come out of that conversation initially, then there's a flag right there. But then, that's why I ask other probing, well, to give me an example of how you failed and what was the end result of that failure.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. What did you learn from that failure? How did you bring that through to your next challenge? Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. And some of the biggest failures I've had are things that resulted in the best success later on.
Oh, we learn best from failure. There's
We
no
do.
doubt about that. Yeah.
We do.
But only if we're vulnerable, only
That's
if
right.
we've got the humility to learn from those failures.
Yeah. You have to stand up and say, that was a big mistake, or this is what we learned from this, or here's what I won't ever do again. And thanks for your patience while we went through this journey. Because often, if you're responsible or for something that failed, there's usually other people that have experienced that failure with you, and they have to feel that they were allowed to do that too. That they were. And then when you're that vulnerable, you can avoid future failures because people will call you on it before you get too far.
Well, I think that brings us to a beautiful end, an end that focuses on vulnerability and humility. So, Ken, thanks very much for your time today. I think that I love conversations around leadership team accountability and culture, and that brings in so many other topics. And but to people listening out there, there are systems, there are processes, there are some great books in this topic. So, if this is a topic that interests you, then reach out. We'll list some of those resources in the podcast notes at the end of this episode. Okay, thanks, Ken. Thanks so much. That was a great conversation.
Great. Well, thanks, Jed. It was a pleasure getting a chance to chat with you. I really enjoyed this.
Okay, thanks. TipTop is brought to you by Metronomics.
To find out more about Metronomics and how this proven 20-year-old system will save you time and money as you grow up your business,
visit metronomics.com. That is metronomics.com.
share your thoughts on today's episode in the comments and suggest topics you'd love us to explore the next time.
Also search for Metronomics in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and anywhere else that great podcasts are found.